Glymore is the director of the Manhattan Nonviolence Initiative. Richard Pitts is the director and co-founder of the Wonder Workshop Children's Museum. John Exdale is currently chair of the Manhattan Alliance for Peace and Justice, an organization that has been active in Manhattan since 1993. Myrta Chavez is Director of Multicultural Services and Programs for Kansas State University, Office of Diversity. Ryan Kelly is a sophomore at Kansas State University, majoring in civil engineering and communication studies. He is a student senator, the parliamentarian for the Black Student Union, and the campus development coordinator for the Association of Residence Hall. All right, that's a busy young man. I've already reminded him, what's first? Academics. Let's get that degree. Let's give our panel a warm round of applause. Look at their names again. Ryan Kelly, Myrta Chavez, John Exdale, Richard Pitts, and Suzanne Glymore. All right, let's get ready to roll. All right, panel question number one. How would you describe race relations in Manhattan, Kansas? And let's just start at the other end of the table. We start the introductions at this end. Ryan Kelly.
Well, thank you, Dr. McGowan, and thank you guys for being here tonight. I was asked to give the perspective of students at K-State, and in doing so, I like to use an example that happened just at the end of September called the Solidarity Rally at K-State. Essentially, how this happened and how this came to be was groups associated with the alt-right and associated with white nationalists put posters around K-State. Multicultural organizations at K-State, Student Governing Association, and administration alike really came together and said, we need to do something. We need to react. So basically, statements were released that took firm stances against those ideologies, and all of those efforts really culminated with the Solidarity Rally on a Thursday night. Walking out of the Union on Bosco Plaza at 8:30 p.m. was an amazing sight. Community members, K-State faculty, students, and staff really showing their solidarity for our students who felt threatened by those flyers and those posters. This is a great example of how our higher-ups, of those in power at K-State, in the Manhattan community, do the right thing when they're pressed to do so. They react accordingly. There's an important distinction to be made between reactive responses and proactive solutions. At the K-State level, as a K-State student, a student of color, I don't see those proactive solutions being put in place. I don't even see them being proposed. It's very difficult to know that when events like these happen, we get the same response. We have a rally, we have a statement, but nothing is really done. And at those rallies, I see some of you that were there, so thank you all for being there. But as a black student, I don't see faces that look like mine. I don't see faces that look like mine from the community showing out, showing their solidarity, and speaking in support for students just like me.
Thank you, Ryan. Ryan tells it for real how he sees it. He likes the beauty of the solidarity coming together in movement, but yet he feels that we're reactive versus proactive. That's his voice, a vision of how he sees the situation. Myrta, how would you describe race relations in Manhattan, Kansas?
Well, I think first I should share with the group, Juanita, that when Juanita called me to ask me to be on a panel, I said, why would you want me on the panel? And she said, girl, because you're going to keep it real. So I guess I'm going to keep it real tonight. My description of race relations in Manhattan is probably that we don't cross race relations, or we don't have relationships with other races. We're kind of isolated and we stay in our own groups. When Dr. McGowan called me to ask me about what was going on in the Hispanic community, I said, I'm really not that connected with it. I'm working all the time, and I'm kind of in my own comfort zone when I come home. But I do feel that sometimes those conversations are difficult, and so we stay in our own areas of comfort, and we don't reach out to others and make friendships of other races. Part of that, I think, is just because of lack of knowledge, and so when we don't know things about other people, then we fear that. I would like to describe that in terms of when I am asked to give a diversity presentation, and I walk into a room and everybody's stiff and like nobody's breathing, and I'm like, it's okay, I'm not the diversity police. That's institutional equity, not me. Sorry, Scott. So from that perspective, I think we just kind of fear the unknown, right? I would like to share a story here recently that would be called a community event, I guess, kind of. So my daughter just turned 15, and we celebrated her quinceañera here at St. Thomas More. And that's a traditional coming of age for a young Mexican-American young girl, which shows that she is moving on to womanhood. And so throughout the reception, growing up and living in Manhattan, as you can almost guess, most of her friends are white. And so when we had the reception and it was time to talk about the giving of the doll, which is her last doll, which shows she's no longer a child, and the changing of the shoes from flats to heels, it shows that she's becoming a young woman and things like that. And so my daughter just happens to be very fair-skinned and very fair hair with green eyes. And so she always gets the question of, are you really Mexican? Are you sure? Are you sure you're not adopted? So I took that opportunity just to kind of talk to her friends about, so I kind of just started it out by saying, I just want all of you to know that Isabel's really Mexican. And so they kind of chuckled. But I think that was just, an opportunity for the kids just to learn, and that it's okay to talk about race, and it's okay to be Mexican, because I think sometimes when people say the word Mexican, it's a dirty word, and it's not really a dirty word. It's who we are, right? And so the kids really just embraced it. They were talking about it, and I think this is how we kind of break the ice, just to talk about, different cultures and different values. And the students really appreciated it. My oldest daughter, of course, was like, oh my gosh, here's my mom with all her cultural lessons, and she's gonna totally embarrass Isabel at her quinceañera. But I didn't, and it was all good. So that's just kind of my input about, staying in our own areas and just being uncomfortable with talking about it. And we really shouldn't, because we're not gonna grow if we don't talk about it.
Great. Notice the wisdom that Myrta is presenting to us. Even though we live in the Manhattan community, I know personally, we kind of live in our own bubbles. If you're with the university, maybe you understand the university community. I understand that very well. I understand my little black church community very well. And I understand my neighborhood. But do I truly understand the inclusiveness and the depth and breadth of the Manhattan community? And that's what we're suggesting to us. Looking at overall, the Manhattan community as a holistic force. Who are we? She talked about the fear of the unknown. Race is very uncomfortable to talk about. It triggers a lot of emotional issues. Daryl Wing Sue has a new book out called Conspiracy Talks, The Conspiracy of Silence. Are we silent about talking about racial issues in this community? But more importantly, how do we prepare our children for understanding their sense of race and their own sense of racial identity? Thank you, Myrta. John, how would you describe race relations in Manhattan?
Well, I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of Manhattan. That has to do with the Riley County Police Department. And in going ahead with that subject, I'm speaking here for the Manhattan-Riley County Coalition for Equal Justice, which was formed in the fall of 2014. It includes the pastor of the Unitarian Fellowship of Manhattan, John Lou Johnstone, Reverend Kayla Simmons Wood from the First United Congregational Church, former advisor to the Black Student Union and 2 past presidents of the Black Student Union, and the new president and vice president of BSU, I think, will be on board with us soon. And then I, as chair of the Manhattan Alliance for Peace and Justice. The coalition was prompted by the American Civil Liberties Union report titled The War on Marijuana in Black and White, detailing in 185 pages the systematic racial bias that exists in police departments with respect to the enforcement of laws against marijuana possession. And the ACLU concluded that a black person is 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person, even though blacks and whites use marijuana at roughly the same rates. The average disparity for the entire country, all states and counties included, is 3.7 to 1. That is, if you're black, you're 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than if you're white. And in Kansas, according to the report, the disparity was 4.4 to 1. The report noted that 10 years of polling data show that black and white Americans use marijuana at roughly the same rate. Not much difference at all. So the emerging conclusion of that report was clear. All across the country, there is a pattern of police bias causing this stark disparity in marijuana arrests. The report also offers statistics showing arrest disparities in selected counties in each state, including Riley County, Kansas. It covered a 10-year period, 2001 to 2010. And in Riley County, the arrest disparity over that time was 3 to 1. That is, relative to the number of black and white people who live in Riley County, blacks are 3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than whites. So in the fall of 2014, our committee formed and immediately brought this to the attention of the director of the RCPD, Brad Schoen, and had a private meeting with him in early fall of 2014. And since then, we've had two meetings with the director of the RCPD. We organized a program for the Black Student Union. They hosted a program in which Brad Schoen and members of the Riley County Police Advisory Committee attended. Well over 100 people were there. The newly formed coalition then began to generate its own reports on racial disparities in marijuana arrests with annual data reported by all police departments to the Department of Justice. And here is what we found. Between 2010 and 2015, arrests for black persons in Riley County are about 4.4 times more likely than white persons to be arrested for marijuana possession. So since the newly formed Coalition for Equal Justice, we've had 3 meetings with Director Schoen, and we also appeared 3 times before the RCPD Advisory Board. Our last meeting with Director Schoen was on September 28th when we presented the latest Department of Justice statistics available, showing the 2015 data on racial disparities in Riley County for marijuana arrests. The CEJ then began to educate the Manhattan-Riley County public on what the ACLU report has found and our own data as well. And we began our own annual reports starting in 2010. In the 6 years from 2010 to 2015, black persons in Riley County are 4.4 times more likely than white persons to be arrested for marijuana possession. So the nationwide rate up to 2010 was 3.7, and in Riley County it is 4.4. And this is the finding that we presented to the Riley County Law Board 2 weeks ago on October 16th. There were at that meeting 40 people in attendance. We have our information packet that we presented to the Law Board by Reverend John Lou Johnstone, and we are pleased to report that the Law Board will appoint a committee to undertake research on traffic stops for evidence of racial bias. 2 members of our coalition will serve on that committee. So things are, I think, moving forward. I think there's growing public awareness of this problem in the practice of the Riley County Police, which may be the result, of course, not of deliberate racism, but perhaps unconscious biases. And we think we are in a position now to push ahead with this before the Law Board and change policy and practice in the Riley County Police Department.
Okay, thank you, John. Do we need to breathe? Yeah. Let's just take a deep breath there. But think about what he's saying. Think about the voice. Think about the stats. But yet, look at the other diverse perspective. There are law enforcement people with us today. Raise your hand. Yeah. You'll get a chance to interact with them in small groups. It's important to hear their voice, their perspective of this issue. Thank you, John. Richard Pitts, how would you describe race relations in Manhattan, Kansas?
I want to say thank you, first of all, for allowing me to be here and to share. I'm going to share a little bit about my personal experience. I can relate to what everyone else has said, but for me personally, when I came to Kansas, I never thought I'd stay here, but I fell in love with it. You know, people pretty much are friendly. They really are, overall. And that's one of the main reasons why I stayed. However, I have 5 children. 3 are white, and 2 are biracial. And they grew up in Manhattan, Kansas, and graduated from Manhattan High School. And man, when they were in elementary school, they had all sorts of friends. It was so much fun going to their school at Eugene Field and Theodore Roosevelt, seeing them interacting with all sorts of people. Middle school, less people, but still diversity of people. You hear me? But high school, well, things changed. Things changed. The white kids in my family pretty much hung with the white kids. The biracial kids in my family hung with everyone. And I said, well, that's great. And I thought to myself, well, why? Why did that happen? We talk about race at our house. We have a diversity of, a cadre of people coming to our house for dinner and hanging out that they know. And I wondered why the white ones, my white kids, when they got in high school, they hung with the white kids for the most part. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that that's who they felt comfortable with. By the time they got to high school, things had segregated enough that there were these barriers and walls between the different races. And I've seen it at K-State. I've been at K-State plenty of times. I've been into that cafeteria. I don't know if it's a natural thing, but sometimes there's not a lot of diversity going on there. And so I said that to say I've been doing this Underground Railroad tour since 1997, and I've taken thousands of people on this tour. From 4th graders up to college professors, college classes, old people like me. And when we take that tour, it's a 5-hour tour. And it's all about race, because slavery was the origins of race. And it was those scientists back in the 18th century and 19th century who came up with this idea, this fictitious idea of race that we all bought into. And since we bought into it, I try to take my people on my tour on a journey, not only through slavery, because when they see African Americans, that's pretty much what they think of. And a lot of African Americans don't know their history too. But I take them on a journey. I said, well, you know, we all have people in our family that say things that are mean. Ain't no doubt about it. How do you challenge those people and change those people's mind, because you're close to them, when they're saying things that are negative and nobody says anything? I said, okay, well, tell me one thing that Africans have created in this world that we use right today, that you use every day. Or just give me one idea of a great African civilization. Nothing comes out. How can we fight racism if you don't know anything about it? If you don't know the origins of it? And we keep doing the same old things over and over again.
I'll save my second part for my second question on things that I think we can do to better this situation, because there are lots of things. Thank you.
I think we better breathe again. Richard tells it like it is, and this is his voice, his perspective, his understanding of what's going on, but he's challenging us to think and be able to hear what he's saying, what he's observed. Suzanne, how would you describe race relations in Manhattan, Kansas?
Well, I'm here to talk about what I've observed from the conversations that I've had as the director of the Manhattan Nonviolence Initiative, talking with all kinds of different community members. And my answer to that question is that it's really complicated in my view. It's very complex. I've had many conversations with community members who are acutely aware of stress and strain around this issue, and who want very much to be personally engaged and participating in making a change. I've had conversations with local community members who have told me that they believe that there are cultural differences that are attached to racial differences. They have told me that they believe that those differences matter, that some cultures and therefore some races are in fact more pleasant or better or better for the greater common good, and that they do not believe in or want to pursue a mingling of those different cultures. I would say that most of the people that I've talked with fall somewhere in the middle of this. Many, many people in our community, I believe, are very uncomfortable talking about this issue, whether it's inside their families or in any of the systems that we all move through. I think people feel confused. There's new language that has come up more recently. There's new terminology. People are uncomfortable, confused about what those things mean, and overwhelmed. Don't know where to start to have a conversation. There are community members that have told me that they would be interested in having conversations, but while they're interested in having discussion around the content of discussing race relations, they're not interested in the heat that comes with those kinds of conversations. So I've heard again and again and again, it's so hard to have a conversation because I don't know that I would feel safe talking about what I really think or what I believe. I'm going to get called a racist. A lot of these folks don't think of themselves as racist in any way. To the contrary, they believe strongly that they are not. But they don't feel free to explore their thoughts and their perceptions, their observations, for fear that they will be labeled in some way or judged in some way. So I would say it's very complicated, and this conversation is incredibly necessary, and creating spaces for those conversations to take place safely and respectfully is crucial. When I look around the room here today, I think I see more of a mix of at least African American and white than I've seen most other places that I've been. That's not what rooms usually look like, even on a smaller scale, I think. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to create spaces where we can have conversations constructively. And I think that's what we're here to do tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Creating spaces where we can talk and be real. talking about the challenges of how to become an inclusive community. What do we need to do? How do we need to do it? What do we need to get in touch with? I'm sure many of you have already heard some perspectives that you maybe had not thought about or even that you disagree. But that's the beauty of a dialogue. Remember, we want to be open. We want to listen. We want to learn. How many of you are committed to developing an inclusive community in Manhattan? Raise your hand. Look around at that. Look around at that. I don't see any hand that's not up. So that's the common value that we share. We want to develop an inclusive community, but we're not sure how to go about doing it. We're fearful, we're afraid. If we talk about it for real, what will happen? Will we alienate ourselves? Will we reveal ourselves? What will happen? But see, that's why we've got to create these safe spaces where we can talk. We can no longer have the conspiracy of silence. It's okay to talk. It's okay to say what you feel. It may not, don't hold back because you think maybe this doesn't sound right, or what Suzanne was saying, maybe I might be perceived as this, I might be perceived as that. We've got to love one another in such a way that we feel comfortable in sharing. Question number 2. What are the underlying conditions affecting race relations in our community? Ryan, how would you respond to that?
I'll speak to a couple things that I see that contribute to the relations that we have between races in Manhattan. First is just unintentional, raw ignorance, right? As a student of color, when I see white students talk about race, they say they're colorblind. They say they don't see the issues that are going on between races. In saying that, to me, that means they don't see, like the previous speaker mentioned, the issues related to the police in Manhattan community, in Riley County. That means they don't see issues, that they don't see why alt-right flyers threaten people of color. But with that, ignorance is a two-way street, unintentional ignorance. When I go to class and I sit in a classroom that's predominantly white, I don't know who hung up those flyers. I don't know who wrote "God hates fags" on Bosco Plaza. We just don't know. And to me, that highlights the necessity for events like these, community dialogues. And then the second point I wanted to make was factions within factions. In Manhattan, there's a black community. At K-State, there's a black community. We don't see that collaboration. As a black student union member, I don't see that collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, when we have events, we don't see people that look like us showing up in solidarity. But again, it works two ways. We don't know these events that are going on in Manhattan. Luckily, Dr. McGowan did a great job of publicizing this, but we don't know those things are going on. So we don't see that support from the community. To me, that's one of the biggest things, is silos within silos and not working together.
Thank you, Ryan. Listen to what Ryan is saying. He's always challenged us. Even though there's a university community and there's a wider community, what Ryan is trying to articulate, it's time for us to come together and work together. That we shouldn't be separate silos. How do we support each other? How do we love each other? How do we work collaboratively together as one community? If K-State is hurting and experiencing issues, that should impact all of us in the Manhattan community. If there are incidents outside the university happening in the Manhattan community, that should also concern the university. We've got to be concerned about what's happening in our community and how do we support one another. But more importantly, many times we're in our own little silos. We don't even know what's happening in other little silos. And it's critical that we begin to come together. Myrta, what are the underlying conditions affecting race relations in our community?
So I think for me, I'm going to talk about national policies that have been implemented here lately that affect our community. For example, the recension of DACA has definitely affected the Manhattan community, especially the Kansas State student community. We have a lot of students that live in fear now about whether they're going to be reported.
Several times, Berger has used the word fear. 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 But notice what she also said. She's challenging us. How can we be a loving community that embraces individuals and understand that everybody in this room is human and everybody should be treated with respect? Let's look at question number 3. If we're to develop an inclusive community, what needs to change and who should be involved? This is our last panel question. John Extell, what would you say? Give us like a couple minutes of wisdom.
Well, I'll continue to focus on the issue here of police bias in Riley County, given the evidence that we have about these racial disparities in marijuana arrests. So what needs to happen? I think we need to make a distinction between traffic safety stops, where someone is clearly violating a rule that we need for safe streets, and pretext stops or investigatory stops, which are done for trivial reasons. Maybe you didn't make a right turn, you didn't use your signal on the right turn, and there wasn't much traffic around, or maybe you were going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. You don't expect to be ticketed, right? Do you, when you're going 5 miles over? But there is an apparently real neutrality with respect to race on these marginal reasons for stopping somebody for a traffic violation. So we might imagine that somehow the Raleigh County Police, just as all of us might go through some sort of a therapy or training program that would rid ourselves of bias, but that may be more difficult than we imagine to achieve. The alternative to that kind of intensive training, in which the Riley County Police Department would have to actually confront its bias in this area, the alternative is to simply change the rules, the practices on police stops. And what we would eliminate are stops that are not really done for traffic violations, but for investigative purposes. They're pretext stops that aren't really aimed at traffic safety, but at possibly uncovering something about the individual driving the car. And that's where racial bias comes in. African Americans bear the brunt of that kind of investigatory, snooping traffic stop. And so I think from the standpoint of policy, what we can do, and what is now being done in some police departments around the country, what we can do is simply change the policy and eliminate these investigatory stops that are not clearly related to some significant traffic safety issue. And I think this really needs to be done not just to be equitable in the abstract, but because minority people know when they're being targeted. I think they have a sense here that they're being stopped for a trivial reason, and that does harm. And that, I think, causes the kind of self-consciousness and race consciousness that they have to deal with in their everyday lives. So that would be my first suggestion in terms of what must be done, and that is to change the Department of Riley County Police Department, change the policy that is, and eliminate these pretext stops, these investigatory stops that don't really have a good foundation in traffic safety concerns.
Thank you. Richard, can you give us about 2 minutes?
I can give you 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Part 2. I'm all about education. Scientists say that kids as young as 3 years old can identify races. I got grandkids, and I believe it's true. And I think the thing that we really need to do is through education. When I do those tours with different folks, or I go into the schools, kids have no idea, neither do the teachers, when it comes to different races and what their cultures and stuff are about. And because of that, we created an exhibit, an award-winning exhibit at the Wonder Workshop. We got some recognition from the Manhattan City when we did that on the Underground Railroad, which showed examples of different races of people working together. That's what our kids need, that's what our students need in high school and in college. Examples are the go-karts to good things. Bad examples lead to bad things, great examples lead to good things. Where are our kids' examples? And there's a lot of white parents. Most of the people I work with, most of the kids I work with, children, they're white. And a lot of their parents, they don't like to talk about race because they're uncomfortable. But if they don't want to talk about it, well, why not bring diversity into your house? That's what my mom used to do. And that's what we did for our children. I think that once you model something and kids see that at home and in school, the golden rule type stuff, and loving everybody like you love yourself, I think things change. But if you're scared to do it, it ain't going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I have to share this story because Richard is talking about how do we talk about race in our home? How do we talk about race with our children? I shared with the facilitators. I had a little nephew, he was 3 years old, and very consistent, the research says that as early as 3 years old, kids began to develop some sense of race or seeing difference. And I had beautiful yellow canary birds who would just sing, and just beautiful birds. And so he couldn't say Aunt Juanita, but he called me Neat Neat. He said, Neat Neat, what color is Peach? That's my canary. I said, he's yellow. He said, no, Neat Neat, what color is he? I said, he's yellow. And he said, no, Neat Neat, is he black or is he white? So here was this 3-year-old kid trying to get in touch with race, and then I just simply said, he's black. You know, I didn't know how to answer it. I hadn't thought that through, you know. And then later I began to think, well, what if I had told my nephew that the canary was white? And where would that discussion have led to? But I think, how do we prepare our children? How do we talk about race when we're just not really prepared to talk about it? Suzanne, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to look at question number 3. If we're to develop an inclusive community, what needs to change and who should be involved?
I think to develop an inclusive community, to me, an inclusive community is a healthy community. And a healthy community looks like any other healthy system. A system is healthy, I believe, if it has balance, if there's not an imbalance in power, if there's not an imbalance in an opportunity to have a voice. So we all live our lives individually, but we're all part of a whole host of systems that we move through. Our families, our neighborhoods, our work, our schools, our churches, and our community. And the same way that to have a healthy family, you have to take into consideration the needs of every family member. And if you have a couple of family members that are challenging or have challenges, in a healthy family, those needs still get addressed. And I believe that in a healthy community, we need to address the needs of all the community members. And we all need to have a voice in that. So who should be involved in making change? I think it has to be a collaborative effort. I believe much of what the other panelists have said, and Dr. McGowan as well, if we're working strictly in the area of our school systems, but are not considering our business community, our law enforcement community, our faith communities, our city. If we're working in each of those areas in isolation from one another, our system, our community system, will remain unhealthy because it won't be balanced because we're not talking to one another. unilateral decisions, even if they're good decisions, or just simply decisions with good intentions, don't create balance. And without that, we can't remain healthy. We can't sustain a healthy situation. And I think that also includes that we constantly need to reassess and recheck in. Our community is changing. Our community is evolving. If we're not continually checking in with how is everyone doing, are we communicating with one another? We may rectify some things for a little while, but they'll crop back up later. So we have to, I would say, representatives from all of the walks of life of Manhattan have to be in conversation with one another.
Thank you, Suzanne. Notice that she's challenging us. What is a healthy community? What is a healthy family? Her discussion is consistent with the Department of Justice model that we've been using for developing these dialogues on race reconciliation. The department suggests that you cannot look at your city in isolation, that you have to look at all systems within the structure, whether it's the social, political, the education, economic, faith-based. You've got to look at all of our systems. And wouldn't it be exciting for all of our systems to be able to come together and talk and to have dialogue? Panel, you were thought-provoking, you were engaging. One more word to describe our panel.
Excellent.
Excellent. Courageous, yes, courageous. Courageous.
Diverse.
Diverse. Other words? Committed. They're willing to speak their voice. And you are just about to have that opportunity to speak your voice. Let's go back before we remember we're at a gathering. All right, how many have already had some sense of deepening of understanding? Yeah. How many have already had some discovery of new perspectives? I'm moderating this thing, but I'm learning too. Yes. I hear new wisdom. Expressing our voice. And notice the beauty of being able to express our voice in not the way to alienate, to isolate, but just to hear our voice and how we all perceive. Reflect about our common values. We all have agreed that we want an inclusive Manhattan community. But more importantly, we want to learn and work together to improve race relations in our community. Let's give our panel a hand. Great job, wise ones. You are going to have unique privilege to now discuss what the panel talked about in this panel discussion. It's an opportunity for you to talk, for you to share your voice. You only have about 30 minutes to do it. We've designed it so that your first